Over history, we've seen divides in race, power, and understanding snowball into violence and suffering, often inflicted upon groups that fall beneath the greatest power. This is Political, and if you're looking for a fresh and unforgiving lens on political history and influential literature, make sure you hit that little red subscribe button under this video or click the link in the description. So welcome back guys, today we'll be discussing the topic of protectionism and paternalism and how this has impacted Indigenous communities in Australia, looking at given perspectives on protectionism in the play No Sugar by Jack Davis, published in 1986, and post-colonial Australian legislation, the Aboriginal Protection Act, passed in 1869. In this case, Indigenous peoples in Australia suffered under treatment that lends to protectionist values, though it is very similar to paternalism. Pure paternalism is where persons or groups of people are stripped of their liberty and autonomy by higher authorities wishing to protect them. In some cases, paternalistic treatment is a good thing when executed naturally and properly, such as child-rearing or guiding away from immediate physical harm. German philosopher Thomas Pogge created a criteria for paternalism, in that it works within human flourishing, including offering basic needs to the subject, being minimally intrusive, and not being understood as exhausted are examples of what was outlined in Pogge's criteria. Though in other matters, paternalism has been used in a more malicious sense, to justify the legitimacy of slavery before the Civil War in the US and as a reason against women's suffrage, saying granting women the right to vote would make their lives more difficult and separate them from their families. Protectionism was an early policy adopted by the Australian government. It was very similar to paternalism in its assumption that Indigenous people couldn't care for themselves and had to be protected by white Australians. Both the texts we'll be exploring today offer a strong perspective on protectionism. The play No Sugar by Indigenous Australian author Jack Davis focuses on the Aboriginal Millamara family and their trials under the jurisdiction of a white government. Protectionism is a prominent theme in the play and is explored from a bleak and depreciatory perspective. This perspective is crucially constructed through the characterization of key antagonists in the play, A.O. Neville and Superintendent Neil. Both written as highly racist and unlikable, the audience is positioned to oppose their colonial perspective on protectionism in order for a truly critical view on the matter to shine through the text. A hostile voice is used and seen in the following quotes. If you provide the native the basic accoutrements of civilization, you're halfway to civilizing him. Neville is suggesting that the Indigenous community should be provided with necessary Western equipment in order to be civilized, hence suggesting they aren't and must be. This is speaking from Neville's perspective that it is better for Indigenous peoples to fit into the Western ideal rather than to uphold their own traditions. Added, "You bloody incompetent savage," a derogatory comment on the Indigenous community's supposed inability to take care of themselves, dehumanizing them to the status of savages. Millamara seems to have learnt her well. Well, I'm going to have to unlearn you. Here, Superintendent Neil is offering another crude character perspective on the matter of stripping Indigenous peoples of their traditional learnings, with the protectionist lens that it is for their own good. To conclude this, it is through this hostile construction of voice upon antagonistic characters who have positive perspectives on protectionism, the text is able to guide the reader to align with its bigger picture that offers a highly depreciatory perspective on the matter. Referring back to Pogge's protectionist criteria, we see that the application of the issue in the text quite clearly opposes this, in that the Australian government's policy did not work in conditions that would allow Indigenous people to flourish and was maximally intrusive on the Indigenous way of life. Now let's contrast Davis's work to another text, the 1869 Aboriginal Protection Act. First enacted by the colony of Victoria, the legislation gave the government's Board for the Protection of Aborigines extensive control over the lives of Aboriginal people, including residence, employment, marriage, social life, and other aspects of daily life. Tied with a silk green ribbon and stamped with the red seal of Parliament, on protectionism, the Act offers a perspective that the government's intervention of the Indigenous lifestyle would be beneficial as an attempt to integrate Indigenous people into colonial ideals. It does so through language and a condescending voice. Some examples: for prescribing the place where any Aboriginal or tribe of Aborigines should reside, for the care, custody, and education of children of Aborigines. The condescending voice and perspective on protectionism, that its mere practicality in a white Australian society is beneficial, really shines through the meta-language used in the legislation that consistently dehumanises Indigenous peoples and strips them of their autonomy, such as stating the things they will be given will not ever belong to them, only to the Queen, and use of the derogatory term half-caste are clear examples of this. In summary, the perspectives between the Aboriginal Protection Act and Jack Davis's fictional play are quite clear in contrast. The play presents the perspective that the excuse of protectionism was a cover-up for a much darker bias that existed amongst white Australians against Aboriginal people. The perspective that protectionism is depreciatory, or in other words belittles and is derogatory towards the Indigenous population and way of life. The Aboriginal Protection Act, however, sums up everything Davis was aiming to critique, offering a perspective that protectionism is beneficial and practical, utilising the excuse of authority to attack the human rights of Indigenous Australians. Don't forget to like and subscribe, even share this video, and follow me on all of social media. My new merch is coming out soon next month, so pre-order yourself a t-shirt. Thank you to my Patreons, your names are listed on the screen. Stay linked for next week's essay on Trump and the fall of Icarus.